Hello, this is Mark Lieberman, the host of The World According to Mark, coming to you through the studios at WPVM LP in Asheville, North Carolina, broadcasting on 103.7, streaming globally on WPVMFM.org. And we have the pleasure today of having the executive director of the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County, Jessie Landl. Jessie, thank you for being on the show today.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So as we talked briefly before we went on air, it's nice to talk about a pleasant subject that doesn't involve COVID, insurrection, Afghanistan. We can talk about those some other time. So I wanted to have you on the show because there's a lot of things that are being done in terms of developments in the Asheville and Buncombe County area. And since I moved here, there's always been this sort of tension between people who've been here for 1 minute, people that have been here for a year, people that have been here for their whole lives, and people who like the good things that the area has to offer, but also they don't want a lot of other folks coming in and spoiling up things. And the development issues are always on the front burner. How many hotels do we need? Are the hotel taxes contributing enough to infrastructure? What do we do about the congested highways? And those things are not trivial, so I don't want the pitch of my voice to suggest I don't think those are serious issues. But as I've said on occasion, one good thing about the development and interest in Asheville is that you've got development and interest in Asheville, because we could be somewhere in the middle of the state of Pennsylvania, where I came from, where they haven't mined any coal in a long time, and they're not doing very much in terms of tourist attraction. So that being said, I brought Jessie on to talk to us about the mission, objectives, and the ways in which the Preservation Society works. But I want to note, of course, that the Preservation Society is not a government agency. It's a 501c3 voluntary organization. It has a relatively small staff. I'll let Jessie, actually, not relatively, it absolutely has a small staff. And you do a lot of things. So first of all, you're executive director. Tell us a little bit about your background.
So I'm actually one of those folks that moved to Asheville. I'm originally from South Florida and grew up there. So whenever people talk about traffic here, I think you guys don't know anything about traffic. Yeah, I grew up in South Florida and went to college in St. Petersburg, Eckerd College, and I was an environmental studies major. That was certainly where my passion lies and still does, and with environmental issues. But it turns out I was never meant to be muddy and in the field. And so it took me a while to figure out how to merge my actual talents in life with my passion, and eventually got into nonprofit work, specifically on the fundraising side. And so before I moved here, I was the director of development for an environmental nonprofit in Florida. And that's sort of how I got started with the Preservation Society. And for me, there's this great crossover with preservation and environmental work. The greenest building is the one that's already built. And so, and I just had this passion for architecture. So I started working here again in a fundraising capacity. And then over time, just really fell in love with preservation work, and my role expanded. And so I've been in Asheville for about 5 years now, and we just love it here. We came for the seasons, but yeah, it's a great place to live. So I understand why people are moving here.
Right. So you understand why people are moving here, and having come from Florida, you understand why people don't want Asheville to begin to look like a a more northern version of South Florida. But let's get serious, or let me get serious for a second. When people talk about preservation, I think most people think, well, what does that mean? You preserve like old buildings. And people are very familiar, typically, if they have any interest in history, in the plaques that are on historic buildings that tell you when the building was built and the famous person that lived there, and whether they were involved in any significant endeavor, whether they owned slaves or didn't, things of that nature. That's what when I hear the word preservation, and I think many folks, that's what they think of. And there are elements of that, obviously, but the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County hasn't exactly been around for all that long. Some people may think that 1976 was, somewhere before World War I, but it had more recent beginnings. And as I mentioned, you don't have a lot of folks working as staff. You do have a board of people who have significant interest, involvement, and experience. But what does the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe do, and what do you know about it as a model or similar to preservation societies across America?
Yeah, so, well, we have a number of different programs. We were a volunteer organization for a lot of our years. And like you said, we were founded in 1976 by a group of people that, started to have concerns about what they were seeing happening in the community. And so we were a volunteer organization primarily through up until the 90s. We had some staff in the 90s. And then it was on and off a little bit. And now we've had staff consistently for the last probably 15 years. And we currently have the most staff we've ever had. We have 3 staff members, including myself. So for us, that's a lot of staff. But we do a number of programs. So the Griffin Awards comes to mind because it's something we've been doing for over 40 years now, where we do an annual award ceremony to recognize the different preservation projects that have happened in the community. We do advocacy campaigns, which I'm sure we're going to get to when we talk about Charlotte Street and the current development threat that's happening there. We do technical support. So anybody that owns an older home, we're here for free technical support. If you're not sure, what to do about the mortar sort of coming loose in your old fireplace, we're the ones you call, and we give you guidance and help you find the right people to do the work. And the other program that we've done since 1977 was the first protections we put on a house in the form of a preservation easement or protective covenants. They're slightly different, but we're going to use the terms interchangeably just for simplicity today. So we have been putting preservation easements on properties since 1977 in Asheville. And it's the only way to permanently protect a property in the state of North Carolina. And so we see folks that have homes that have been in their family forever, right? And they want to make sure they're protected going forward, and they'll make the donation of a preservation easement on it. Or, there's all different reasons people do that. And so we have those easements, and that comes with a level of responsibility for the organization. Those easements are in perpetuity. And so we're responsible for monitoring and ensuring that those homes are protected, or those structures are protected in perpetuity going forward. So we do annual monitoring, and we're also, again, available to the owners for technical support and that sort of thing. And then something else you kind of made me think about, the world of preservation has changed, I think. I think a lot of times people think about preservation and they think of grand old mansions, and absolutely that is a component of it. But we talk a lot about the fact that we don't necessarily, it used to be architecturally significant buildings and historically significant buildings. George Washington slept here, right? Those are the two areas. But one of the things we focus on a lot now is culturally important places. So you might have a place that doesn't have grand architecture and doesn't necessarily have the famous person who once stayed there. The Thomas Wolfe Cabin's a great example of that locally. But something that's culturally significant to a neighborhood or a community. And so that's something else that we focus on.
Well, I want to pick up on one thing that you said, Jessie, and that is you said that easements, as an example of a tool that's available, is one of the only ways in which you can protect architecturally significant or historic properties in North Carolina. Now, as I was reading, I noticed that there is something called the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources. And I don't know the extent to which there's interface between the Preservation Society and them. But I guess what you're saying is, and you, again, I don't know what your travels have included besides Florida and North Carolina, but are you aware that in other states there are more tools, restrictions that are actually a creature of state law and regulations, and we don't have that there? So, as tends to be the case, volunteer organizations such as yours has to step in to fill the gap.
Yeah, there's some state to state variations. So it's easiest to kind of focus on exactly how North Carolina does it. And there's a couple misconceptions. And again, we're seeing this a lot with the Charlotte Street properties there's a development threat on Charlotte Street. Some folks are coming in and they want to demolish 12 homes that are historic. And a lot of people in the neighborhood were really shocked because these homes are all contributing structures to a National Register district. And a lot of people think that if you're on the National Register of Historic Places, then there's some sort of protections that come with that. But unfortunately, there are not. We like to say that the National Register is all carrot and no stick. So there's actually some really beneficial tax credits you can take advantage of for rehabilitations on historic properties that are on the National Register. But the flip side of that is that if you haven't taken advantage of those tax credits, you can demolish a National Register property anytime that you own, anytime you want, with no restrictions on that. The next level of designation in the state of North Carolina is a local district, a local historic district, or a local landmark. And examples of local districts, Montford's sort of the most famous one. I also always point out Biltmore Village. People wonder why the McDonald's looks like it does in Biltmore Village. They had no choice. It's a local historic district, and so new construction in those districts have to fit the style of the district. And so in Montford, there are these restrictions that, tell you what kind of alterations you can make to your house. And you have to go in front of the HRC, which is the Historic Resources Commission, which is part of, the city government, in order to ask permission to make alterations to your historic home. But even still, even if you live in one of those historic districts, you could put in a demolition permit for the property. You'd have to wait 365 days, but then you could demolish a home within a local historic district. So again, there are these protections in place, a little bit more than what you see in a National Register district, but still not any sort of permanent protections on a property. And so the preservation easement that we do, where the property owner actually donates an easement, a little bundle of rights on the property, is, like I said, sort of the only permanent way to protect a place in North Carolina.
All right, so let's focus on that. So the issue of permanence is what distinguishes the rights and restrictions associated with properties which are merely historic. Now, I say merely, I take it, and this is not necessarily what you specifically do, to become a a historic property to be on the National Register, you have to prove something about the historic elements of the building or whatever it is that you're trying to protect. Not everybody can, get on there, obviously. But again, I take from what you're saying is, so long as you have a property which is characterized as historic for national preservation purposes, that does carry with it obligations while you are living in, owning, managing, meaning you can't put a green, yellow, red door on a Victorian home, or you can't take down the pillars of a whatever to put in a jacuzzi tub in the front yard. That's what you're saying are the restrictions there, and that works in terms of the actual use of the property. Where the fork in the road is if somebody wants to knock down, it's easier to be able to knock it down than it is to make a gaudy improvement to the property.
Oddly, yes. So National Register, again, comes with no restrictions. So you could do whatever you wanted to your National Register home. The only time there's some limitations is if you do decide to take advantage of those tax credits for rehabilitating the home. Then they want to make sure you're doing it to the, properly, to the historic standards. But in terms of the local districts, right, there's these limitations, but the flip side is you could potentially demolish the home. In terms of the work we do not limit ourselves in any way to properties that are on the National Register or that are locally designated. Because as you pointed out, I think it's an important thing to point out, it's not easy to get those designations. And there are so many properties in Asheville and elsewhere that are completely worthy of historic preservation, but don't meet the exact standards for one reason or another, or just the hoops are too big to jump through. It's too much work to get there and too much money, because there's a certain amount of expense with the work that goes into getting a property on the National Register. All of that said, one thing I will say is one of our programs that I'm most proud of is our grant program. And we actually started it in 2017. And we give grants that are between $500 and $5,000. We do it twice a year in order to hopefully be available for emergencies. And part of the focus of the grant program is our underserved communities. And rural communities, getting a little outside of Asheville, because we're Asheville and Buncombe County, but Asheville can draw the attention a little bit. And so the thought was really that we needed to start getting outside of Asheville more, and also that we needed to reach some of our underserved communities that don't necessarily have those historic designations. And one of the things that our grants are for, so this is what kind of led me here, we do the traditional bricks and mortar. Somebody's got a plumbing emergency at a historic church, we're going to give some funding for that. But we also give funding for designation, because designations can be beneficial in different ways. And so for folks that are going for that kind of designation, we can fund the work that goes into that. So one of our early projects that we funded on that front is the South Asheville Cemetery, which is a cemetery in the Kenilworth neighborhood. It's sort of tucked away. A lot of people don't know about it, but it was the African American cemetery, and they believe through ground penetrating radar that there are over 2,000 people buried there, but there's actually only 92 gravestones. And we funded the National Register nomination on that property, which is going to be beneficial for them for future fundraising and that sort of thing. So that designation is helpful. And so that is one of our programs that we do.
But let me be clear, the designation, who issues the designation?
Yeah, so the National Register is a federal program, and there's actually the Secretary of Interior standards that are followed. And so we have an office the State Historic Preservation Office here in Western North Carolina, and that's the office that oversees that process, and it goes through Raleigh when the decision's made. Yeah, and so what you need to do is hire a consultant that's going to write a nomination and do the historic research on the property to go for that designation. It's a little bit of a process.
So let's move a little bit, but first let me recognize to those just tuning in, we have Jessie Landl, who is the Executive Director for the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County. And we're trying to learn about what the agency does and how it figures significantly into development and preservation at the same time in the Asheville and Buncombe County area. So I know we are going to talk eventually about Charlotte, but I wanted to set sort of an introduction here. One of the ways that we've already mentioned that the Preservation Society can work in a proactive way is, well, first you mentioned grants. While as significant as those grants may be to the individual recipients, we're not talking about millions of dollars. So you're a 501c3, you get your funding through donations. I don't know whether you get any government funding in addition to that, but that's not a lot of dough to work with. So you have this other tool, and we have a couple of tools, but one is the easements. So again, when you say easements, to most people, their eyes glaze over and they don't necessarily understand the distinction between an easement and a restriction and, whatever. So let's talk about, there's easements that power companies have. Typically, that's where most people get an understanding of it. You have property, you can keep people off your property, you can put no trespassing signs. But if you want power and electricity and cable service, those entities typically have secured easements, and you're not allowed to drive them off, and you're not allowed to mess with the power lines. That's what people know. But with regard to the easements you're talking about, it is an agreement, so to speak, between the property owner and the other side of it, which is in this case the Preservation Society. Can you sort of explore that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways it happens. From time to time, we'll actually own a property and we'll place the protections on the property before we sell it. But more commonly, it's when someone comes to us and donates this bundle of rights. So in a lot of ways, it is very similar to the power company having a little bundle of rights on your property. We have a small bundle of rights on that property. And when a property owner does that, there's a lot of flexibility for them. So we tend to meet with the property owners and learn about what's important to them at the property. And we'll also speak to what we see as important at the property in terms of architectural features on an old home, let's say. And so sometimes it's just a facade easement. It's an easement that protects the exterior of the home. And then sometimes a person will have interior features that are really important or that we think are really important to the property. And we'll talk about putting protections on them. So there's a lot of flexibility in what's protected as part of the easement. And so a document is drafted and it lays out, the responsibilities of the Preservation Society to enforce this easement in perpetuity. And then it's recorded and it's it's now attached to that property in perpetuity. And so anyone that purchases that property in the future is tied to that agreement that's been made. And so on all of our easements, we monitor them annually. We visit the property and we, see the condition of whatever features are included in that easement. And of course, let the property owners know if there's repairs that need to be made or that sort of thing. So we've been doing it since 1977 in Asheville, like I mentioned before, and we've got really great relationships with all of our easement property owners. Usually if someone buys a historic property, it's because they're excited to own a historic property. And so they want that kind of, they're happy for that kind of guidance and relationship with the Preservation Society. So it's been a really positive program for us. And I always like to point out, it is our responsibility to legally hold people to that easement. But since 1977, we've never had a legal action on any of our easements. So it's gone pretty well for us. And it's been a way to permanently protect a lot of really important buildings.
Well, that's a remarkable record, actually, that there hasn't been any legal actions. But let me delve a little bit deeper into this. In the Asheville area, while there are obviously historic properties, unlike older cities in the north or the city where I came from before I moved to Asheville, Philadelphia, you don't have a lot of buildings. You may not even have any buildings that go back to like the 1700s or
Right.
so. Historic here typically means something that had an origin in the early 20th century, and the so-called Victorian homes, because some people, again, who don't travel around into the neighborhoods but go downtown, eat at a restaurant, have a drink, go home, don't realize that there are legitimate historic properties, residences and the like, dating back to the early 1900s, the mid 1900s. And there's no magic number before you can't characterize it, I guess, as an historic property. Is that correct?
So typically it's 50 years.
50 years, okay.
And so I think that, from time to time that challenges preservationists, because now we're heading into the 70s. And I think there's some preservationists that are going, oh, the 70s. But I'm excited about going into the 70s with historic protections. But yeah, so typically, traditionally, it's 50 years is the rule. And I will say not positive this is true, but I think the earliest building we have an easement on is Ravenscraft, which is thought to be the oldest remaining building in downtown Asheville, and it's 1845. And we do have an easement on that property, just to give you a sense.
So where I was going to go with you on this is, with these easements, you earlier mentioned carrot versus stick and so on and so forth. So you have, there are some carrots. A property owner that wants the benefit of protection of, let's say, a home forever and ever, can get this designation and do it through an easement, which is the drafting of this legal document. It looks very much like a deed. It lays out the rights and responsibilities and so on and so forth. And a lot of people that's important to them. They even after they pass, or they would like to know while they're still alive that this property is going to be preserved. The other carrot, which is available, is the tax benefit. So talk, if you will, a little bit about how that works with the IRS portion of this.
So this can get pretty wonky. I apologize in advance. So you can actually take a tax benefit for the development rights you're giving up.
So you're making a contribution. So I'll help a little bit as a former lawyer.
Yeah, you do the lawyer part of this.
Okay, so the lawyer,
not my area.
I'll do that. Hopefully, I can do this without being licensed in North Carolina. The lawyer part of it is that an individual who grants the easement, meaning gives it, is giving away something of value. And when you give away something of value for a charitable purpose, and a charitable purpose includes obviously giving it to a nonprofit charitable organization, then you're entitled to get a credit for the value of that. And I looked on your website, and they give an example of somebody that, you know, owns a home that has an appraised value of $100,000. They give away or they bind themselves to this restriction, but they're actually giving rights to the nonprofit. And I don't know if this is still true, but it looks like the IRS would value that at 30%. I'm not sure where that number comes from or if it changes, but that would then end up being in effect saying, I have $100,000 property, I'm giving away 30% of that in the form of this easement because I don't have total control over it. And that means there's $30,000 in tax benefits. Does that help?
Yes. So yes, you're giving up potentially some value. I don't know where the 30% number came from, but yes, you're giving up some amount of value potentially. But it can also be a little larger just than the value you gave up by taking on those restrictions. Like I said, it can also be the development value you gave up. When we're talking about, this is the one sort of distinction that's important. It has to be a National Register building and a contributing structure to the National Register. And then you can take sort of a tax benefit for the development rights. If you could build 10 stories there and there's only a 1-story building there and you've put this easement on it, and so it'll never be a 10-story building, you can take some of that, you can take that value in tax credits or tax benefits. Like I said, it gets a little wonky. It's definitely not something that we advise on. We advise that it's available and that people should talk to their accountants and their legal representation.
Okay, but again, that's a tool. The other tool we'll talk about, and then I keep promising talking about Charlotte Street, is you can actually identify a historic property that is potentially in danger of being demolished or, you know, changed in significant character, and act as maybe not the ultimate buyer, but purchase the property and then potentially resell it and maintain a historic designation. That seems to me like that's a little more complicated, but that I think has even come up in the Charlotte Street development. So do you want to talk about that for a moment? But before you do, we're talking to Jessie Landl, Executive Director of the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County. Go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, so there's a couple different tools we use in this area. So in the past, we have used a tool called an option to purchase. So we will actually purchase an option on a property. The best example of this that I can think of is the Patton Parker House. It was owned by a group of descendants. They were ready to sell it, but it was really important to the family that this place came with protections on it. So they came to the Preservation Society. They asked us to market the home for sale with this bundle of protections that was going to come along with it. And so the benefit of that is typically these properties are in disrepair when people come to us in this case, and they're looking for someone that's going to be a really good steward for a historic home. And so we're kind of the right people to market it for them. And so we actually had an option to purchase in the Patton Parker House for, I believe, 3 years before we found the right person to purchase that property, rehabilitate it, and that's got permanent protections on it going forward. So that's one tool we use in those cases. So when we do purchase, we've bought this option to purchase, so we do end up purchasing the property, but we only own it for 20 or 30 minutes. And during that time, we place those protections on it. The new buyer is fully aware that that's coming, and then they purchase it from us. So it's one of these situations where we've lined up this new buyer, and we're kind of just the middle person. That's one tool we use. We have more recently been looking to use and actually did quite a bit back in the 90s and early 2000s, a tool called a revolving fund. So a fund that is intended for purchasing a property, stabilizing it in some ways, a lot of times, not always fully rehabilitating, but sometimes just getting it to a point where the next person can take it on. And then selling that property to the next owner, and again, putting those protections on it during that time. So A great example of one of those that we did was in the, I think it was, I'm trying to remember if it was the late 80s or early 90s, but the manor on Charlotte Street, the big manor grounds right there by the gatehouse. That's an 1898 building, and it was in disrepair. It was considered a fire hazard. The Preservation Society actually purchased that building and then spent time figuring out who the next owner was going to be, put the protections in place, and sold the property. So again, permanently protected. And so that was when we bought outright with this tool, a revolving fund. And so we're starting to look into getting back into using that tool more. Like I said, it was something we did quite a bit earlier in the organization's history, and it's just been sort of less used more recently.
Okay, so I think we're finally ready to talk about the elephant on Charlotte Street, which is the Charlotte Street development. So first, let's talk about what is Charlotte Street. There's a development that's been proposed for some number of blocks.
Yep.
There's some number of homes that are considered to be historic. They're Victorian era, so we're back in that 1920s, 1930s, whatever era. The development that has been proposed involves both apartments, commercial, retail, whatever. And people have been, a lot of people have been unhappy, angry, protesting, not, pitchforks, but pretty pitched battle, opposing it for a number of reasons, some of which may or may not involve, where the Preservation Society is. But they're opposed to it because they don't want any more traffic. They know that if it's going to have greater density, there'll be, multi-story buildings cramming in, I don't know, 195, the number has varied, units. And then it is proposed as part of the development that some 12 to 13 homes has varied, and something like 120 old trees, which I don't know if you can get preservation rights on a tree. Maybe you can, but in any event, they're mad about that. Now, in connection with all of that, you have the City Council of Asheville, which has certain rights and restrictions that it can impose through the zoning process, and the developer has applied to the city for some kind of conditional zoning permit, which we're not going to get into the weeds on. But all that means for purposes of this discussion is that it has to cooperate. The applicant has to cooperate with the city, and the city gets to make presumably the ultimate decision, subject to legal challenges down the road. But the Preservation Society is involved as well. And again, I'll repeat your website. It says you're not opposed to the development per se, but you have some definite concerns about what is being proposed, and also some options about what you would like to see, or the society would like to see, that would make it not happy for everybody, but possibly a compromise solution. So with that introduction, let you lead into it.
So I'll try and lay out what the proposal is now. Like you said, it's changed a lot. Originally, there was going to be 13 homes demolished. Now it's 12. The numbers have changed ever so slightly, but I'll try and lay it out. So the block in question is the 100 block of Charlotte Street. Directly across the street, you have the Fuddruckers site. And that does add a little confusion to it because there's also a proposed development for the Fuddruckers site. So just keep in mind, we're talking about across the street from Fuddruckers, there's 5 houses that are along Charlotte Street, early 1910s-ish houses along Charlotte Street. And then Baird Street, East Chestnut Street, and then Furman Avenue on the back side of the block. So we're talking about all 4 sides of the block. There are houses, residential houses down Baird. There's 2 residential houses on Furman, and there's 1 on East Chestnut. And altogether, there are 12 homes. They're all contributing structures to the National Register district that they're in. And they're slated for demolition. along with 117 trees. And these are really, if you drive around the block, they're really old, mature trees. And there's also a stone wall along that block. They're going to actually take that stone wall out and grade the whole property down to street level. So we're talking about a pretty big change. So in addition to the homes and the trees that'll be gone, the block is also going to go from 45% impervious cover to 80% impervious cover. And along Charlotte Street, the zoning is weird here. There's actually 3 different types of zoning on this block and an overlay district. So it's a lot to digest when you start to get into the zoning issues. But to simplify, what I'll say is along Charlotte Street, they're only allowed to build 2 stories currently. And what they're asking to build instead is 5 stories. Their development would have, as it's currently proposed, 181 residential units and right around 50,000 square feet of commercial space divided between office space and retail space, and a 5-story parking garage. And so it's a significant jump, this conditional zoning that they're asking for over what's currently allowed on the property. So I think that's one big concern of a lot of the neighbors, is we're not talking about a place where you can go 2 stories where they're asking to go 3. We're talking about a place where you can go 2 stories and they're asking to go 5. So it's a pretty significant conditional zoning that they're asking for. And then of course, there's folks that are concerned about the historic homes themselves, which is certainly where our concern lies, and the character of not only the neighborhood, but that Charlotte Street corridor, and how that's going to be, seriously altered. And then of course, like you said, there's folks that are very concerned about the traffic. I think what's added to that concern is the recent road diet along Charlotte Street. So Charlotte Street went from a 4-lane road to 2 lanes with a turning lane. And that happened just recently. And now we're talking about adding this major influx of traffic. And I think that's got a lot of people concerned, especially when you look directly across the street at the Fuddrucker site and we're seeing a development where I think they're also in the range of about 180 units there. Of course, we've always thought the Fuddrucker site is a really great spot for redevelopment along Charlotte Street. But I think, again, the neighborhood is challenged by the level of density that we're talking about. One thing we've been pointing out is that the Living Asheville comprehensive plan that was adopted in 2018 by our city council calls for 12 units per acre along the Charlotte Street corridor, which would mean that from, the interstate to Edwin Place on Charlotte Street, you need to add 278 units or something along those lines. And here we are talking about, nearly 400 on one intersection. So we're talking about far exceeding that goal. And the final decision, as you pointed out, is going to be made by our city council. So this project has worked its way through city government, and city council is the final vote on the conditional zoning, whether or not they get that conditional zoning. And we're in the 2nd month that it's been postponed, and the developers have had some pushback, I think through their own admission, some pushback on the project, obviously. And, it'll be interesting to see if there are changes made to the plan, or if they're sort of biding time a little bit and waiting for the interest in the project to die down before they go in front of city council. So we're trying to keep it really in the forefront of people's minds. And as you said, we've gone a couple different paths in terms of different solutions. We think it's a great.
Let me ask you just for a moment, Jessie, because that's very helpful. So it does sound to me as if city council has a pretty heavy burden in terms of demonstrating that it is working for the benefit of the city in this project, which is, you mentioned there's an overlay. Obviously, the developer can't build anything near what it is proposing without getting the permit from city council. And the way you've described the proposed development, it seems to me that if you looked at Charlotte Street today, minus, Fuddruckers, which for my purposes has always been an eyesore. I wonder how that got approved to begin with. But in any event, you look at it today, and then you look at it after this development goes into place, if it is accepted along the lines, and it'll be like night and day. There will be nothing left of whatever the character was before. You're transforming it into something totally different. And all those people that are going to be living in those apartments, and all those people that are going to be parking in the parking garage, 5 stories. I don't know how many cars that has, but it looks like we're talking about 300-400 cars potentially. That is going to clog up those intersections. And I'm not partisan about this in particular. So the question is, why, before you even get to the role that the Preservation Society can play, why is this thing even in the process of close to being, quote, approved, subject to a few minor tweaks along the way? I hope that doesn't put you in the political spotlight, but that's what I just did.
No, it's okay. I think the answer is what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, which is that we have we do need additional density in the city. There are people moving here. We have affordable housing needs in the city. The city has stated goals about additional density along Charlotte Street. And I think that this is why, we've tried to be really clear about the fact that the Preservation Society isn't against development, and we're not against adding density. But we think it belongs in the form, especially here, of infill construction. We actually give an award at the Griffin Awards for infill construction that's done well in historic districts.
What does infill construction mean?
Meaning fill in the empty spaces with new construction. And to me, that's the healthiest way for us to see a city grow. So the block that's in question has actually got a lot of empty space. If you walk that block and you take a look around, you realize that a ton of density could be added to that block in addition to what's there. And it could be done in a really much more healthy way for the community. The existing units are naturally occurring affordable housing, right? These houses currently have, the 12 houses in question have, we think, around 35 units of affordable housing in them currently. The development proposal is to knock these houses down. They've asked for a land use incentive grant to give them funds to incentivize putting affordable housing units in. So they're talking about adding back 30 units of affordable when they're getting rid of 35, adding back 30 affordable. They'll be less affordable than they currently are, and it'll come at a cost of $1.5 million to the city of Asheville. Just under 1.5 million. Just
what is that cost associated with? How does that?
That's the land use incentive grant. So it's a great program, but what they do is they're setting their taxes. Their taxes will not raise when they do this new development. So their taxes will stay the same as they are currently for 13 years, and that'll end up being close to $1.5 million over the 13 years, right, in taxes that the city doesn't get in exchange for 30 units when we already have these 35 naturally occurring units. So one of our suggestions has been, among many others, we've had a retired architect who did a rendering of what it could look like if you did infill construction. We've offered to purchase the property through some of the mechanisms we talked about earlier. And one of the other suggestions we've had is that they get a land use incentive grant or something similar, some sort of similar support from the city to subsidize some work on the existing homes that the homes do need, but to then deed them affordable at 60% AMI, which is around what they're at now, as opposed to the 80% AMI that they would be with the proposal they brought in for the new construction. And then use infill construction on the rest of the block to fill in the empty spaces, build something that works for the neighborhood, and kind of a win-win for everybody. And that's what we would really like to see in that space.
So let me see if I understood one of the things that you said that I think is important. Um, the 1.5 million or somewhere in that neighborhood of money is available to this developer, even under the proposed plan, which would eliminate some number of affordable homes and put up, and I don't want to disparage the design, I've looked at it, but somewhat of a cookie cutter design of buildings that one sees many places around Buncombe County and Asheville, having none of the character issues that people are concerned about if these existing Victorian homes are demolished. And they still get that money, but they get that money, and so one has to wonder, again, politics here, why would the city think that's a good deal to give the tax abatement, so to speak, to fund a development which is going to generate a lot of revenue for the developer ultimately, who's going to have both apartments and commercial structures, and I mean commercial buildings and offices and so on and so forth. I don't know. Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah. So the developers applied for this grant. They went in front of the committee. The committee did an interesting thing. They approved the grant by a 2-to-1 vote. But they added a condition onto that. The structure on the property we haven't talked about is the Asheville Arms Apartments, which is sort of on the back of the property on the corner of Furman and East Chestnut. And that's an existing apartment complex that they're planning to keep, at least for the time being. And what the committee said is, we're going to approve this grant on the front section of the property if you apply for a second grant to deed 20 apartments in the Asheville Arms affordable for 20 years. The developer hasn't said yet whether or not they're willing to do that. So that's kind of in limbo at this point. But, you know, I think the intentions are good. They're seeing this notion of, okay, we could have, you know, 50 affordable units. But I think what's important here is the level of affordability, 80%, AMI, which is your annual median income, which is not, I forget the exact numbers, but I think the person at 80% AMI is making up to $42,000 a year. That's not particularly affordable for Asheville. And again, the fact that then as taxpayers were investing in this development, when instead we could look at the existing structures, talk about how they contribute to the character of the community and to Charlotte Street and the neighborhood, and they provide affordable housing, and they're green because they're already built, and with much better products than are often available in today's building practices, and say there's a better way to accomplish our density and affordable housing goals. The city themselves, in a report, I believe it came out in January, shared what's missing in our housing stock for affordable housing. It's this middle housing. It's these multi-unit dwellings. And these homes are the perfect example of that. Some of them have, you know, 5, 6, 7 units in them. So it's the perfect housing for us to be looking at and saying, we need to keep this. And I think the challenge is this notion that we have to give developers what they want for them to do the project. And I think that Asheville has proven that it's a really desirable place to live, in part because of our historic architecture. And it's okay for us to say to developers, we're going to expect more out of this project. You're going to have to give a little bit more. And I think that they're going to stick around and do the project anyway, because Asheville is a special place and there's money to be made. But we have to push them to do that. And they're not going to make that choice on their own.
So we just have about 5 minutes left, I've been advised. So let me just ask you a couple quick pointed questions. Hopefully the answers will be quick and pointed if I get it out of my mouth. Asheville is not Charleston or Savannah, because it would seem to me that if anybody proposed doing what's proposed to be done in the historic district in either of those two cities, it wouldn't get off the ground, literally. And there's nipping around the edges about things that could be done to improve it. But where where are all the tools? Where's the easement stuff coming in? Where's the grants? Has anybody talked to the owners? Apparently there's one family or a group of family members that own a good deal of these properties. Where's the efforts being made, if there are any, to say, hey, wait a second, you want development, we know you want a return on your investment, but be a part of the city.
This family's owned these properties for going on 40 years. They've been buying up property along Charlotte Street and specifically on this block. They bought a house on this block as recently as 2016. So it's definitely been an effort to own as much of the block as possible. One thing that's important to know is there are 4 privately owned homes in the block. So those are people who are really in the thick of it, right there on this block. And in fact, one of those families recently went under contract with the developers, not necessarily because they want the developers to, it wasn't something that they wanted to do, but it was what they were left with in terms of options if they didn't want a 5-story parking garage in their backyard. And so it's really challenging because they own it all, and they are partnered with the development company, so they're part of they're involved in this plan. And like I said, we've made offers to purchase the property twice now. One was in the form of an option to purchase, which I talked about earlier. They didn't like that. We came back with a solid offer. What I did is I lined up folks that wanted to buy every property on the block, including I had 4 of the properties spoken for by a local affordable housing nonprofit who would have turned the 4 houses into, they were 16 units that would have been deeded permanently affordable. And the other 8 houses would have been bought by individuals with protections placed on them through the easement program, and the developers were not interested in selling to us. They've never given us a counter offer on price or anything like that. So we have made those overtures. We've talked to them about the rehabilitation tax credits, which they could take advantage of if they were to rehab these buildings. And so far, we haven't had any luck.
Okay, so there's been a meeting or 2 that has been postponed by the city council. That's coming up. I don't know if there's a specific date for that, but what do you hope to gain through that proceeding?
It's currently scheduled for September 28th. This is what I keep telling people. Every month, we have to have the votes to make sure that this doesn't go through. The developers only have to have the vote 1 month. So people really need to stay active, stay vigilant, go on our website, sign up for our emails. I let everybody know what's going on, when the vote's going to be, how we're mobilizing, how you can be in touch with council to share your thoughts about the project, and just stay involved in the coming months because we don't know how long these things will drag on.
Well, that's a good place to sort of bring this to a close. Where can people go, get the website and get information, and how specifically can they be involved?
Yeah, please go to our website, psabc.org. And like I said, there's a place on the homepage where you can sign up to get our newsletters. You can become a member, which is a great way to support us. And we'll keep you up to date on everything that's going on with this project and everything we're doing as an organization.
Well, thank you very much, Jessie Landl, the Executive Director of the Preservation Society, for a highly informative and interesting view of what's going on in Asheville with development and how your organization is seeking to try to bring good things and preserve good things in the city. I want to thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you, Mark. I had a fun time.
And I want to thank my producer, Focus Solutions, Shelley Lieberman. We'll have you back, Jessie, hopefully, as things move ahead. Thanks again.
Take care.